In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can bulk update records in Airtable using Zapier. And for example, why I'm doing this in this situation is we have one table which are onboarding forms that people fill out. And then we have another table which is becoming our new table to manage all members. And we want to associate all those previous contracts to the new members and old members. And we're going to be doing this using emails and IDs. And it shows off some of the advanced features of Zapier as well. So let's jump right into it. The way that I kickstart this automation is not using a typical trigger because I'm actually just going to run this manually for the most part. And the way I do that with Zapier is I just add a random webhook to the front of the step, because then that means I can enter the URL of the webhook and it's going to trigger the automation to run. So where do you actually get that webhook from? I mean, the webhook URL. When you create the webhook, you'll be given this URL that I have obviously blacked out. But when we want to actually run this automation, all you do is copy paste that URL and you pop it into your browser and just push enter, and that's going to run the automation. A quick overview of this automation as a whole is you can see I kickstart the automation, as I was saying, with a webhook. And then I'm going to find all of the records in an Airtable view that's filtered to everyone who doesn't have the field that I'm interested filled in. That's just to make it simple to identify all the people. And then with all those records, because they come back as line items in Zapier, which means we can loop through them and work on them one by one, we create a loop from the line items. Then we find the record in the other table by email, because we have the email in both tables. And then we just associate back the record. So then we have that field completed and people will leave the view. And I've done this several times when I've had to backwards fill a lot of fields in Airtable or Google Sheets, for example. And I really like this approach. And now I'll go into some of the detailed steps of the more trickier parts. Finding all of the records that we want to update was actually something that was tripping me up a little bit when I first tried one of these approaches. And you can see here the approach that I ended up taking. As I said, I create a view in Airtable with all of the records that need to be filled, and then to find all records, I couldn't use the normal search value in Airtable because you have to enter a value. You can't just say search by this field and leave it blank. It doesn't know what to do with that. So what I do is I use the custom advanced search formula, and I just take any field that I know is not going to be empty, like a name or an email, and I say, give me all the records that have the full name not equal to nothing. And as I said, since I'm limited to a specific view, I know that view is filled only with people who don't have the contract field or the onboarding form field completed. So I'm progressively fetching all of these people. A step that I found trips up a lot of people that I have worked with in regards to mentoring is not knowing or understanding how the looping functionality works in Zapier. And if you come from a coding background, this is a bit more obvious, but Zapier does it in its own way, same as Make.com does it in its own way. But for example, I've added the looping step in Zapier, and you can see here, for the looping to work in Zapier, we have to define, firstly, what fields we want to take into the loop. So each time the loop runs, what fields are going to be available to us? And then also, how do we want to name those fields? So on the left-hand side, I've defined what I want the fields to look like in the actual loop. And these are the fields I'm going to be using in the loop as variables. And then on the right-hand side is all the rows and values I got back from that Airtable search. So I'm giving it all of the IDs and all of the emails, because that's the two things I need for my loop to be able to work. And I'm going to call it ID and email. So each time it runs, one of the IDs is going to be associated to email, one of the emails is going to be associated to email, and next time it runs, moves to the next one, etc., etc. So that's how the looping works. In this case, what I also did is I limited it to 10 times per run. And I think that's generally a smart move, because when you first test it, you obviously don't want to realize you made a mistake and you run it on all 100 records and now you're kind of screwed. You run it just on a handful, and then if it all works, you can increase it to 20 and run it a couple of more times just so you can go through all the records. Obviously, if you have thousands of records, that's a very different discussion, And maybe doing it in Zapier is not even the best approach there because you're going to use so many tasks, for example. To show you one example of the step in the loop, now we're actually inside the loop and how we use the variables. I'm just going to show you this one step that finds the person in the original table. So you can see here, I search by email address. And earlier I defined in my loop, I'm going to have two variables available, ID and email. And you can see here, it says number 4, which is related to the number 4 step or action I created. And I'm using the email variable. If I called that variable email address, for example, in step number 4, the word email address would be shown up here, just to make it super solid in your mind of how those defined variables work. So I find the record based on the search value. And one thing that you might find interesting is I actually say it should be considered a success even if I don't find the record, because in the next step I check, was the record found? I do this just because I don't like having the history log on Zapier having lots of errors unnecessarily, because I don't necessarily think it's always accurate. But that's just a preference. To be honest, you can do that if you want, but if you're running lots and lots of records and throwing lots and lots of errors, your Zap could get turned off by Zapier because it thinks something's a bit odd there. So I do it this way just to not have the history log show up as lots and lots of errors if we can't find those original records. Because I can just go into Airtable afterwards and look who didn't end up having something assigned to them. So I don't really need to have it throw those errors unnecessarily. In the final step, what we have here is, now that we found the original onboarding form or contract that we want to associate back, we do that in the last step with an update record in Airtable action. And you can see here again, I'm using the ID variable that I declared in the loop-in setup, because I don't want to have to look up the record again and add an extra step. I just have the ID already. So I take the original ID and I'm saying now associate that record we just found, which is the onboarding form / contract. And then as you see here, this whole setup, as I said, is going to bulk assign all of these records instead of having to go through and do it manually. It took me maybe 20 or 30 minutes to set up and just work out how to do it, versus someone sitting there and clicking for an hour or two. If there's hundreds or thousands of records, you don't want to pay someone unnecessarily to do that type of thing. What I showed you in this video, I felt was a great example of a use of advanced Zapier functions in regards to the loop-in, how to use the filtering, how to trigger an automation with webhooks, how to also then declare the variables in that loop, which can confuse a lot of people. But also, how can we, for example, whether it's Airtable in this case, using the filtered views and things like that, or in Google Sheets, how do we mass update records without having to get tricky with code and all these types of things? So I showed you how to do that in Zapier, and I think this is a great example because a lot of companies I'm working with, they're often having to do these migrations of sort as the company grows, as we set up new systems, and you don't want to have someone sitting there manually clicking all these buttons and doing it. It's a waste of time for those people, and I'm sure they'd be more interested in focusing on other things, or yourself, and you can do this all in 20 to 30 minutes. Or if you don't even want to do that, you can obviously just reach out to me and follow my channel for more videos like this.